Hi everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to the Seminary Co-op. Thank you for coming out in this weather. Today we're very excited for the event, and before we start, I just wanted to thank the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and also mention a few other events that we'll be helping with tomorrow, and then I'll hand it over to Tracy Matthews. So I just wanted to mention, first of all, we are proud to be a member-owned co-op, so if anyone here is interested in joining that, please speak with me or one of my colleagues after the event, and we'll be happy to talk to you about that. So tomorrow we will also be helping out with another event that's part of the All Power to the People part, the Black Panther Party at 50, part of that ongoing event this weekend. So the events tomorrow will be The World is the Children's Classroom, the Black Panther Party's Oakland Community School documentary in progress, which will be tomorrow at from 4:30 to 5:45 at Saye Hall, room 021. And also in the same place tomorrow we'll have Love Liberation, 50 Years of Black Panther Party History at the same place, like I said, at 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So I just wanted to thank you guys again for coming out and welcome Tracy Matthews, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Race, Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. So I'm going to hand it over to her, and please join me in welcoming her and the whole event.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on our first official day of snow in Chicago to celebrate and hear Robyn Spencer talk about her new book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland. Again, we want to thank Seminary Coop Bookstore for hosting us, and also the Intersectional Black Panther Party Project, the IPHP, which is a new group that was formed by a group of us, 4 black women historians, who came together on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party to talk about the need for a deeper analysis of women and gender and the role that women played in the party. So we founded this project to recover and restore women's history, women's critical roles in the organization. And we use the hashtag Changing the Narrative. We want to do that by centering women, gender, and sexuality in the history of the Black Panther Party and the larger history of the Black Power movement, amplify the varied experiences of women in the party, and share the mic with Panther women. As we've said a couple times already now, this is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party, but today is also the anniversary of the assassinations of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, Black Panther Party leaders who were murdered here in Chicago by the Chicago police with the aid of the FBI. So I'd like us to just take a moment of silence to acknowledge their contribution to the struggle and their commitment and the ongoing struggles ahead of us. A moment of silence. Thank you. So today's talk will start out with Robyn is going to read a little bit from the book, and then she'll be joined by her interlocutor, Jane-Rhodes. So I'm going to introduce Jane first. She's a professor and head of the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's trained as a mass media historian with a specialization in African American history and culture. She focuses on the study of race, gender, and media, the history of the black press, media and social movements, and African American women's history. Her book, Framing the Black Panthers, The Spectacular Rise of a Black Power Icon, will be published in a second revised edition from the University of Illinois Press this January. She's also the author of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, The Black Press and Protests in the 19th Century, and was featured in the award-winning documentary, The Black Press, Soldiers Without Swords. She's currently, her current research investigates radical activism in the black public sphere, and she's also co-writing a biography of a black American expatriate and psychoanalyst tentatively titled Transatlantic Blackness in the Era of Jim Crow, The Life of Marie Battle Singer. Robyn Spencer is a historian who focuses on black social protests after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. She teaches survey and seminar courses in African American heritage, civil rights, black power, and black women's history in the U.S. at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York. Her writings on the Black Panther Party have appeared in the Journal of Women's History, Souls, Radical Teacher, and several collections of essays on the 60s. In 2016, she received a Mellon Fellowship at Yale University to work on her second book project, To Build the World Anew, Black Liberation Politics and the Movement Against the Vietnam War. This project examines how working-class African Americans' anti-imperialist consciousness in the 50s through the 70s shaped their engagement with the movement against the Vietnam War. She's also working on a short biography of Angela Davis for Westview Press's Lives of American Women series. Professor Spencer is a committed activist and participates in many community education initiatives aimed at bringing the history of the Black Power movement to community-based spaces. She has presented her work at universities, correctional institutions, and K-12 classrooms. She hosted an interview show sponsored by the campaign to bring Mumia home called Inside the Activist Studio, aimed at recovering the history of Black radicalism in the 60s. And in 2016, she served as one of the co-editors of Radical Teacher's special issue on Teaching Black Lives Matter. So please join me in welcoming Robyn Spencer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm so excited to share with you some of the insights from my work. This is actually my very first book reading. I signed my very first book earlier today, so it's just been really great. I'm really glad that everyone's here to be part of the moment. So I'm just going to sit for a bit and then talk a little bit about some of the ways in which the book grew out of my understanding and engagement with what was going on in my world in the 1990s, and what the implications are, I think, that the books and the insight that it has for our contemporary moment where the Black Lives Matter movement is in full steam, right? And we're kind of dealing in the wake of the recent elections in the U.S. So it's very much a book for our times, I think. So I want to just share with you a little bit about the background around my writing of the book, read a little bit from it, and then I'll be in conversation with Dr. Rhodes. So this book began as my doctoral dissertation. I learned about the Panthers when I was an undergraduate student. I was in college at SUNY Binghamton, and it really grew out of my engagement with a class called Women in Social Movements, where I was given the book Assata by Assata Shakur, which is Assata Shakur's autobiography to read. It was the first time I'd ever read anything about the Black Panthers, and I just became really interested in finding out more. I was very inspired by her struggle and her the passion that she had for justice and everything that she went through. It was like almost like a different, opening a door to a different kind of world, and I wanted to learn more. And I soon found that after I did maybe about a semester or two's readings on the history of the Black Panther Party, that I'd come to the end of the line. There were no other books, there were no other autobiographies, there was just nothing else for me to read. And I thought to myself, as I was thinking about becoming a history major in college, in graduate school, I should say, that it would be a great topic to learn more about. Now, in the larger world, you know, this is the 1990s, and me in particular are based in New York. So there was, of course, a lot of focus on things like the Central Park jogger case, and the racism in the media and describing that. There was a lot of international changes going on with the end of apartheid, Nelson Mandela being released in 1990, and South African apartheid officially coming to a close several years later. There was the World WTO protests. There was a lot of police brutality around people like Eleanor Bumpurs. These are cases which maybe if you were not around at that time may not seem as familiar, but just as familiar as we are today when I say Trayvon Martin or I say Renisha McBride or Sandra Bland, something comes up, an image or a story. Those are what the things that happened for me in the 1990s, and also I should say Rodney King was very influential because it was really the first moment that we had with the visual representation of all of the violence that had been going on. Of course, today things are very different where we have that visual, 1,000 times over. So those were all the influences on me as I was writing the book. And I really wanted the book to be about what I thought was very important about the Black Panther Party's history, which was its organizational structure. I felt it was very important to understand the Panthers as a political vehicle, and a political vehicle that young people self-consciously tried to build. So I was interested in how they paid their bills. I was interested in how their ideals changed over time. I was interested in the rules that govern being a member of the organization. And when I went into the archives and when I spoke to people in the process of doing the research, I found that there was actually a lot of information about this that was out there. And I felt it was just so important to challenge the way in which Black Power had been defined as a movement that was emotional, that was disorganized, that lacked the vision, that was short-sighted, and instead recover the history of Black Power as something that was deliberate, something that was deeply intellectual, something that left incredible roots that are sprouting, into trees and flowers today. We're still living in the wake of that moment. I really wanted to challenge the way scholars, activists, even lay people thought about Black Power, because when you look in any textbook today, I could have done it in the 90s, but one could even say today, there's still the narrative of the angry 60s. The good 60s with Dr. King then turns into the angry 60s with everything that comes afterwards. And I wanted to replace that anger with a sense of love and comradeship and deep dedication, which were all the things that I felt that the people within the Black Panther Party that I was interviewing and meeting, that's to me what they represented. Which is not to say that they weren't flawed, which is not to say the Black Panther Party didn't make political mistakes, but really to think about the organization in a way that could allow for that type of critique instead of a dismissal, right? So this book very much takes the Black Panther Party seriously as a liberation organization. It looks at its roots and its origins in Oakland, California. The first chapter really talks about the roots of Black Power in Oakland and what does it mean. So I want to read a little bit from a description of what happened when Black Power kind of came to Oakland, California. And of course, Black Power came to Oakland in different waves, right? The activists in Oakland were very deeply connected to what was going on in the Southern Civil Rights Theater and also regionally, right? The book also hopes to challenge the idea that the struggle of the Black freedom movement was primarily unfolding in the South, right? To think about not a South-North narrative, but a narrative that includes the entire country, including the West Coast. So this is the state of Oakland in 1966. So by 1966, the flatlands of Oakland, where most of the Black residents lived, was facing residential segregation, poverty, unemployment, police brutality. It had become a cauldron of discontent. Observers noted that the condition of African Americans in Oakland were so dire that Black dynamite might erupt. And I go on to talk about the impact of the Watts Rebellion and being catalyzed by incident of police brutality. And the idea of Oakland becoming this another Watts was something that garnered the attention of the nationwide media and of policymakers. And the question was, well, what was to be the future of Oakland? Was there going to be this Black dynamite? And I argue that the Panthers and Black Power in Oakland was that Black dynamite. Right, Oakland never had any sort of wide-scale mass protests the way it erupted in many other cities. And I talk about how the Panthers played a role in sort of channeling and providing an outlet for the type of outrage and righteous discontent that people felt by 1966 after facing those conditions. And I also try to put us back in the moment, because when I say 1966, it may feel like any other year in your head, but if you imagine that the Montgomery bus boycott started in December of '55, and if you joined the movement at that point in 1955-56, in 1966, it's 10 years later. You know that your college career could have unfolded twice in that time frame. So by 1966, there wasn't a sense of a young movement. There was a sense of a movement in transition, and Black Power was the name and sort of the way in which this transition manifested itself. So in the 1960s, a vibrant movement spilled out from local high schools and colleges, neighborhood centers, street corners, spearheaded by Oakland's most dispossessed residents. They drew upon Oakland's long history of political activism, to create organizations tackling everything from poverty and housing to police brutality, right? And what happened in Oakland as Black Power took root is that they held a lot of conferences. People don't associate that, like what the Black Power activists did. Well, they held conferences. But they did. They very much saw themselves as in an intellectual tradition. They very much drew on the scholarship of activism and protest at the time. Frantz Fanon, Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong. They very much saw themselves as part of this intellectual global transformation. And they wanted people to come out and hear that. They wanted and encouraged people to read and be part of that. And I think that that's really, really significant when we think about, how we think about Black Power and what its legacies were. So the Panthers get started in 1966, founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And they go out there into the larger, wide universe of activism, and they have to try to convince people to join. Right. So I talk about their evolution of their initial 10-point platform and program, some of the initial activities that they engaged in, and then also how gender became a major portal through which we can sort of see the Panthers evolving as an organization. So women joined the Black Panthers in 1967, and the inclusion of women within the organization really transformed its vision and the directions in which it went. So the Panthers did not simply replicate the sexist assumptions, role patterns, and rhetoric that was promoted by some Black Power activists who felt that male supremacy was part and parcel of fighting white supremacy. So the women I spoke to who joined the Black Panthers, they would oftentimes say things like, well, I tried to go join the Nation of Islam, but I wasn't into that. Or they had very strict ideals about what women should be doing and what men should be doing, and I didn't relate to that. So I wanted to be part of something where a woman could be as active and as visible as she wanted, or at least there weren't rules like that to the contrary. Right? So women started to flood into the Black Panther Party, led by Tarika Lewis, who was the first woman to join the organization. And they really helped to provide the backbone of the organization. A lot of the early people who joined the Black Panther parties were based on networks of people who knew each other. So you would ask the person that grew up with you in the neighborhood, and then maybe their younger brother would come in, or you were joining the Panthers in your high school, and you may have asked some of your friends if they wanted to check it out. So it kind of grew like that. It was an organization of people who knew each other, who had experience with each other. And when women started to increasingly join, it really brought in a broader range of activism. So, for example, some of the early women were veterans of the struggle for Black studies at San Francisco State University, and they had played a major organizing role in that, and they brought those skills to the Panthers, right? So I think that's also very important, because oftentimes we don't think about the Panthers as coming into an organization already as activists. But yet when we think about it, some of the main people that we may know, like Kathleen Cleaver, for example, was coming from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So as the Panthers grow nationwide in this time period, I talk about the ways in which their struggle around armed self-defense sort of manifests in both gaining them traction and allowing them to be spotlighted as an organization that's standing up, and how important it was for them to say no to police brutality, to provide this alternative example. So there's a great scene where Bobby Seale talks about the police patrols that the Panthers went on and what it was like to patrol the police. And when you're reading it through 2016 eyes, you realize that when you're reading it through 2016 eyes, I really felt like, wow, you know, any one of these things could have gotten these people, them killed, at any point. So imagine that they're there and they're with their shotguns and then they're confronting the police, and then the police have to back down, right? Because they're within the law, they're within their rights. It's just a really powerful, I think, statement. And the fact that they took that stance of armed self-defense and they broadened it from actually carrying a weapon as armed self-defense, this idea of defending yourself from poverty, defending yourself from want, defending yourself from unequal education, they started community programs as a way of defending the community from those things, right? Whether it be the free breakfast for school children, whether it be the free medical clinics, that was part of their larger apparatus of self-defense. And the fact that they were able to be so tactically nimble, the fact that they increasingly promoted this leftist ideology really earned them the terror, of the state, right? They became victimized by the FBI's counterintelligence program, where the FBI worked in concert with local police departments to harass, to infiltrate, to, yes, even kill, right? We're here on the anniversary of the death of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, and it's so important because important to realize that they were trying to stop a movement from happening. These were not just randomly targeted individuals. These were people who were skilled organizers, who were able to motivate people, and when the FBI attacked the Panthers, they were, in a way, trying to defend everything the Panthers were trying to dismantle. Right? So the Black Panthers definitely faced those realities. Now, the book also goes into the Panthers' history in a long view. So I don't only look at the early period of the Panthers' history from its founding in '66 until the height of repression within the organization in the early '70s, but I look at the Panthers until the demise of the final community program, the Oakland Community School. So I look at the Panthers in the '70s because it's an organization that changes, right? They're adapting to the times as the movement is moving towards economic justice, as the movement is moving towards electoral politics. The Panthers are making those changes as well. So one of the things you'll find out in the book is that the Panthers created a church called Son of Man Temple, and they were like, well, if that's where the people are, that's where we're going to be. We're going to provide our political alternative to a spiritual gathering in order to, increase the amount of people that we can speak to, right? They start to negotiate different terms with the petty capitalists in the neighborhood that they may have been vocally critical of before, but instead now they're trying to figure out ways of commonality, right? So it very much speaks to the whole Buy Black campaign, and raises interesting questions about where we are today in terms of understanding that relationship. They also focus on institutionalizing the community program. So institutionalizing means now trying to figure out what financial structure is going to prop up those programs. Are those programs going to be based off of donations, or are they going to start to grant rights? Right? And as they start to go into those areas, they realize that the more that they get into the bowels of the system, it opens doors within the organization to things like IRS audits, right? And mismanagement accusations. And so the Panthers really, I think, are dealing with all of that in the 1970s. And so they're really putting in a lot of work. And so I try to look at the organization through a grassroots, kind of a bottom-up approach to really think about what was it like to be a member within the organization at this time. What was it like to submit yourself to the discipline of the organization because you believed in the larger goal, the larger structure, right? When you were in the organization, someone, oftentimes not yourself, maybe you had input, but determined your day, right? What were you going to do today? Very hard for us to give up that kind of, power over our own lives. What are you going to wear today? How many material items are you going to have? When are you going to have to wake up, right? In sort of a reciprocal relationship to that, the Panthers provided for their members. They provided health care, they provided child care, they provided ideological nourishment, they provided homes for people to live in, and it's really a beautiful thing, I think, to think about the Panthers in this sort of organizational relationship to each other. And which is not to say that it was always harmonious, because of course just put you half of the room together in a house to live together, for a common goal, and after a little while, there may be quite a lot of tensions and conflicts between all of you well-meaning people, right, who are committed to the same goal. Who's going to wash the dishes? Who's going to cook? Right? Who's going to clean? Right? These kind of questions were worked out on the axis of gender. And Black Panther women continue to find voice within the organization, and you'll see that within the book. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that the Panthers really were in a close relationship to each other. You know, what I call comradeship and what they call comradeship. It was more than friendship, because you didn't have to like your comrade. That you were committed to the same goal, and you looked out for each other. And oftentimes, there was a joy in that. There was a comfort in that. And that's important. I wanted to bring that out in the book because, again, oftentimes Black power is perceived as just being so angry, and people, you don't imagine the joy that people got out of the work that they did, or the love that they had for the people that they did that work with, the love that they had for the people that they were serving, and the love that they had for their larger community. Which didn't mean it wasn't sacrificed. Towards the end of the book, you'll see people writing their resignation letters, where it's now 1976, right? Okay, you joined the Black Panther Party in 1966, it's 1976, maybe you dropped out of high school or college. It's 10 years later. Now your mind is turning to different things, whether it be family, whether it be economic stability, whether it be parenthood, whether it be, you know, you're going along the path of your life. And the question is the organization still going to be able to meet your needs as you meet its needs? Right? So you'll see that in some of the resignation letters at the end of the book. And I end the book with just a comment on where we are today. So this is a needed history. While the lament of needing a leader seems to periodically emerge from communities seeking change, the need for organizations is heard more rarely. In particular, Black power organizations are assumed to be irreconcilably different from their counterparts earlier in the timeline of the Black freedom movement. So we're told about the beloved community and Dr. King, but we don't imagine those things could have happened in the context of a Black power organization, right? There's much to learn about the organizations at the helm of the Black freedom movement of the 1960s. The nuts and bolts of the Black Panther Party's organizational history reveals the human strivings and failings of young people bent on transforming the world and themselves with the tools that they had at hand as they ran election campaign and conferences, as they staffed community programs, and as they stood up to the police. It is a story that is both heart-wrenching and beautiful, and at times heartbreakingly ugly. It is our history to examine and learn from. Right? So really, when I think about this book, it's really my contribution to a library of struggle. Right? There's so many scholars who have written so wonderfully about the Black Panther Party, about the Black Power movement, about the Civil Rights movement, and this is another way to sort of get an insight into what that time period was about through the lens of organizational history, through the lens of gender, and really taking that cry for Black power seriously. So that's what I'm trying to do in the book. So I'm happy to provide that overview before speaking with Jane a little more. Thank you.
I wanted to say thanks to Tracy Matthews for inviting me to have a conversation with Robyn, and most important, congratulations, Robyn. I know this book has been a long time coming. I was thinking about it when I've been reading the book over the last couple of weeks, because I was working on the Black Panthers in the early 2000s, and I had to write a short essay about women in the Black Panther Party, and there were two pieces, one by Tracy Matthews and one by Angela LeBlanc Ernest, and that was the sum total of the work out there at the time, and then your dissertation. And I remember when I finally got hold of your dissertation, how much it really opened up a hidden and obscured part of Black Panther history. So thank you for sticking with it and getting the book out, because this is not an easy task, and it's a wonderful read. I thought maybe I'd start with how you ended, because I teach African American Studies, and I just finished teaching Introduction to African American Studies at UIC. And so at some point in the semester, I throw out these sort of word association or name association questions, and I said, what do you all know about the Black Panther Party? And you can imagine what the answers were. I'm sure this happens to you all the time in your classes. And there were two things that I found really interesting, and I wanted you to talk more about this. On the one hand, the sort of they are the popular imaginary, and these are all, mostly African American students, is about violence, right? They associate the Black Panther Party with violence. At the same time, the Black Panther Party is so compelling to them. They're really hungry to know more, much more than any other figure in the Black Power movement or in the late 1960s and early 70s. So could you talk a little bit about why you think that's the case, that the Black Panthers clearly seem to speak to this moment, and young African Americans in particular, young activists in particular? And then the other part, which is, why is violence the sort of dominant image of the Panthers?
Okay, good questions, I think, to start off with. Definitely, I think the Panthers are associated with the violence. Oftentimes people don't know exactly what that means. Does that mean that they were the purveyors of violence? Oftentimes it means that they're the victims of violence. Oftentimes it means that their rhetoric suggested violence or that they performed violence. They're not quite sure, rhetoric, reality, what happened. But just like Malcolm X has become boiled down to by any means necessary, you're not quite sure what that means, but he said this. He could have meant anything, right? The Panthers definitely sort of get the same treatment. Now, on the one hand, I think that one of the appeals of the Black Panther Party was the way that it stood up, right? At a time where people felt very, very afraid and disempowered. We may relate to those times. There are lots of articles about how to speak to your kids, about how to interact with the police, what can you do to change your personal behavior, how can you become less of a threat. And then there's all this evidence that even you may do those things 1,000 times over and you're still victimized. You could be filming someone's death, calling a police officer sir, and never raising your voice above that tone, as we saw in the case of Philandro Castile. So comportment and style was very, very important to the appeal that the Panthers had, right? They were rhetorically very strong about standing up and speaking out and fighting back against what they felt was the propaganda of the system in defining what black protests could look like and could be like. So it's very important to them to embrace armed self-defense. It was very important to them to verbally sort of challenge and call out what they felt was sort of wrong with society at the time. That made them very threatening. I think that there was the content of what they did that was threatening, and there was the fact of the vessel that they came in that was already threatening, the fact that they were poor, urban, black people who were the ones doing that. That, by any nature, made them threatening, right, to the system and to the state. And I think that they themselves went through this evolution on how they were going to look at the role of armed self-defense within their organization. It was something that they felt committed to. It was something that they felt was important in terms of exercising a right. And it was something that remained something that was part of their history, even as the laws that legalized what they were doing would shift and change to sort of shape what they were doing. But to me, the most troubling part is that we don't understand the context that the Panthers were in, so that we tend to focus on them and associate them with violence, but we don't associate the times with violence, right? It's like we hear about Malcolm X, but we don't think about all of the violence that was part of the civil rights movement. We may hear about the 4 civil rights workers in Mississippi in the summer of '64, for example, but we don't know that when they were draining those rivers and swamps of Mississippi to look for the bodies of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, that they found so many dead people, when they were doing that. So these were violent, violent times, and the Panthers kind of arose in those times. And the interesting thing is that their rhetoric never suggested sort of this offensive violence, that when people did do acts that were outside of the pale, they were immediately removed from the organization. And you sort of see them really trying to grapple with, how do we maintain this sort of image and substance of being oppositional and resisting and promoting armed self-defense, yet how do we remain disciplined, right? You may have somebody that's attracted to that. And then when someone comes to you and says, well, I want to be a Black Panther, and you say, well, here's your book, and be up at 5 o'clock to feed the kids, they may not have that in mind, right? So you have to transform their consciousness, all the while, promoting this idea of standing up and self-defense. So they had a sort of a difficult path to follow, but I think that they were remarkably successful in doing what they did.
Yeah. Thank you. Your book, the subtitle, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party, foregrounds gender, foregrounds women. And again, most people, the sort of popular history, the popular imaginary, the only women in the Black Panther Party that people know about, if they know of any women, are Elaine Brown, maybe Kathleen Cleaver, but really Elaine Brown because of her memoir, Taste of Power. And one of the things that seems to me, and I would suspect that you would agree that Elaine Brown's book does, is to paint a pretty sort of one-dimensional image of gender politics within the party and the experiences of women. Because it's her experience, and she's only narrating what she goes through. So could you talk a bit more about that, the sort of multi-dimensional nature of what it was like to be a woman in the party, and particularly for women? I mean, one of the things I love about your book is that it's about the rank and file, right? It's not about the celebrity Panthers. It's not about the sort of marquee people who are on the posters. It's about the people who are doing the day-to-day work. So if you could talk a little bit more about how their experience is perhaps different from Elaine Brown's and others that we hear more about.
Thank you for asking that. I mean, I think that oftentimes the people that we sort of, when we see or we hear about the Black Panther, it's a male image, period. Even though we may know theoretically that, okay, women were a large proportion of the members, and in fact, women were the majority of the members at different parts of its history, somehow the image that we see is a male image. And I think we don't see that male image doing things, right? We see that male image maybe posing. I think when you look through the lens of Panther women, you get to see the work that was being done by both the men and the women. And I think that that was the experience for women within the Black Panther Party. I think one of the things that I love about the Panthers is their acceptance, just like any other 60s organization. Again, if we put this half of the room, in their own house to work together for liberation, we may come back in 2 years, there may be some babies, right? So people within the Black Panther Party, they had social relationships with each other. They fell in love with each other, in and out of love with each other, and the children that were produced, the organization, they were the babies, they were the cubs, and the Panthers really tried to help women who were mothers within the organization, whether it be through child care, whether it be through, sort of accepting and centralizing that child as part of the political project. So I think that would be one thing I would say about the Panthers in terms of what it meant to feel like you were a political woman within the Panthers, because oftentimes you may be a woman and then committed to different things, but then that child comes along and it becomes harder, if not impossible, to keep all of those balls in the air. And I think the Panthers did a good job with that, and they did that because women demanded that, right? It wasn't just like, oh, what a great idea, let's do this. It was the women who said, look, we need these things in order to do our political work. So I think that being a Panther woman meant oftentimes being a mothering, being part of a collective that was in support of what you were doing. It meant negotiating failed relationships, but remaining connected, right? So this relationship didn't work out. This is still your comrade, though. You have to figure out a way to keep it going, right, in a lot of ways. And then you see that commitment even all those years later. I think that also being a Panther woman meant struggle. It meant that oftentimes you may have the skill set. If you were a woman who came to the Panthers, as I mentioned, the earlier women, and you were coming from San Francisco State, where you were a student activist, and now you were put in charge of running a program, maybe with men who didn't want to take orders from a 19-year-old woman, you know. So you had to struggle with that. You had to literally sort of engage in that kind of political struggle, the struggle to demand respect for yourself and your skills. I mean, I think that's a struggle that Panther women also went through. And also just your struggle for bodily integrity, to figure out, you know, what it meant to be someone who maybe had more options because of a time evolving with the women's movement and discourses around sexual freedom, with the availability of birth control and the dialogue about what that meant for political people, right? All of those possibilities were there, right? You were not in the track of maybe where your parents had been, right? So one of the things I like to look at within the Panthers is that, you know, they had weddings, people got married, there were couples within the Panthers, there were couples who were open in terms of the relationship that they had, and there were couples who were not. You know, there were couples who went through conflict, there was interpersonal tension, and I think that women had to negotiate all of that. I think that for the most part, especially in the areas that I'm looking at in Oakland, that women felt that they found their voice and they were able to articulate it, at least to speak up against some of the things were going on. At the same time, you definitely had a lot of backward ideas within the organization, and not just coming from men, sometimes also coming from your peers, from other women, right? At the same time, you may have men who may be more of an ally to you than a woman. So I think that Panther women really struggled to actualize what it would mean to be a revolutionary in this time period. How would you live your life? What would your day-to-day be and look like? And I think that's one of the exciting things about thinking about the Panthers, is to kind of imagine that struggle being just laid bare a little bit more, to sort of see the skeleton of that.
Yeah. Skeletons, indeed.
Yes.
One of the things when you're talking about the sort of gender politics of the Panthers, you talk quite a bit in the book, towards the later part of the book, about Huey Newton's often cited statement about sexuality and oppression and gender. Could you talk just a little bit about that? And do you think that that sort of opened up the conversation within the party, at least as we're moving into the 1970s?
Well, one of the things to highlight is when Huey Newton came out of prison, he issued a statement where he talked about, he criticized what he saw going on within the organization around him. And he talked about the Panthers becoming more open and aligning themselves with the gay and lesbian liberation movement and the women's movement. And it created a lot of backlash, and the FBI actually moved in to that moment of organizational conflict to heighten it, by sending letters, by saying, what is Huey, doing now? He wants us to be soft, and using all of the coded language to make it seem that the manhood that so many people had held on to was now being threatened by Huey Newton. I think that the impact of that letter was very big within the organization. I think it likely opened the doors and conversations. I think one of the things that's clear is that same-sex relationships were happening within the organization, even though they may not have been outed or visible or discussed in that way. So when I say I come to you in the house and 2 years later they're babies, that's just the evidence of heterosexual relationship. We don't know what's going on, amongst others as well. So I think that because the Panthers were open to that statement created a lot of, it sort of revealed a lot of tension. It also revealed the differential in that I believe that the relationships between men were perceived as in a different way, right? They were more harshly judged, less tolerated. They were seen as, in a way, challenging manhood, in a way that the relationships between women were not. There's a great article that scholar Akinyele Umoja has just written, well, not just, I think he wrote it last year, but he writes about Kwesi Balagoon, who is in the Black Liberation Army, and he's bisexual. And, you know, I think it's one of the first articles to really come out and talk about, like, radical Black liberation politics and what does it mean to have one of the most loved and respected figures to be bisexual. I mean, we really police very, very closely, I think, the sexuality of men, especially the men that are perceived as, you know, being these heroes within the Black community. So I think that when Huey Newton issued that statement, it kind of opened the door to all of that. Now, what I found just in the archive, you know, again, just sort of evidence that people were engaged in sort of loving across, you know, the divide of sex and gender, and they were, they found a way to do that within the organization. But I consider it an untold story because there hasn't been enough research into, you know, exactly what that meant and things like that. But I think that the impact of that letter suggests that masculinity being hard as versus being soft, those were understood in gendered ways. And the idea of the Panther standing up and everything that I said earlier about the self-defense, we always assume that that's a male character feeling those things, or those ideals are embodied in gendered male. When we think about self-defense, we're not thinking about feeding children. So,
Absolutely, and so much of the survival programs were really about sort of family and community. I was thinking also about the program, at least in California, providing transportation to visit members who are incarcerated, family members who are incarcerated. That was a really powerful thing that was particularly in the service of women in the community who couldn't afford to get out to the boondocks in order to see their partners and their brothers and their sons in prison. So there was such a range of those issues. I guess the last question I'll ask is, you talk quite a bit about the archives, going into the archives, and I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about how you did your project, sort of how you got to it. You interviewed some fascinating people, and I thought the audience might be interested in knowing how you were able to put this together.
oh, great question. I mean, I loved my research process. When I first said, I'm going to write this issue of the Black Panther Party, this was 1990, people thought, well, are you a Black Panther? I thought you were so nice. You know, are you going to pull out a gun? Are you going to get a job when you're done with this little research project of yours? Right? So there was a lot of, I want to say it's resistance, but it was masked. It was in a velvet glove. Like, you know, we're just want you to think about these things, Robyn. You know, be careful. So it was tough, you know, because one of the questions that came to me was, is this going to be, what are you basing this on? You know, the Black Panther Party was an organization, says who? Like, are you just talking to people? You know, is this more ethnography? Is this really history? And right in the middle of all of that, the Huey P. Newton archives opened at Stanford University. And they didn't really open. The collection was deposited, and it was really the first time that there were boxes and boxes and boxes of organizational records that had been sold to Stanford Library by the Huey P. Newton Foundation, which was run by David Hilliard, former party member, very important role, and Frederica Newton, Huey Newton's widow at the time. So the fact that those records were there gave me kind of legs to stand on, where I could say, you know, oh, look, I can go to Stanford, and I can look in those boxes and see what's there. And I was able to write to the historian who was overseeing everything, Claiborne Carson, and he was kind enough to let me in there before they had been cataloged, because unless you don't know, I mean, archival deposits can remain uncatalogued for years, for decades even, as libraries search for resources to try to see what's in those boxes. So I got a chance to go in there, and it was really an amazing process for me, because I didn't go in there with a strong sense of, oh, I'm looking for these topics, so I'm going to look in these 7 boxes, and then I'm out. You know, I was like, I have to read everything. This is new. No one's ever seen this stuff before. So I pretty much read like every single thing that was in the archive, and I tried to listen to as much as I could, because they were cassette tapes, they were reel-to-reel tapes. And again, the technology to make those things available just weren't there. I was able to listen to some cassette tapes, but the reel-to-reel tapes, I never got a chance to listen to. I'm assuming that they've digitized them now if they were able to find the funding to do that. So I got a chance to like hear, you know, what the Panthers were really talking about, and to look at those records. And that's when it really became clear to me that this organizational history was actually another window, right, into this organization. That I could see different things, I could understand different things, that there was something to be had by looking at the folder that says bank statements. Even just to flip through there and say, well, how are they supporting themselves? Right? I found out that actually they got a lot of money from royalties on the books that they wrote. Right? People wouldn't assume that. You'd say, well, are they like, you know, terrorizing vendors and, you know, robbing people or banks to get their money? But no, they're actually writing books, and then they're getting the proceeds from, you know, from those books, and or advances on those books, because people are reading those books. Right? And that was one way that the movement funded itself, right? It gives a different sort of veneer to what you're thinking about when you think about what that organization is doing. So I read those folders that said things like bank statements or health records, you know, to find out, well, okay, if you get sick in the organization, what happens to you? Where do you go for health care? What about your dental care? How do you manage to live in this organization, you know, for all of these years? So it was very exciting to do that. And then over the course of the time of doing that research, I was able to interview people. It was exciting to interview people in the 1990s, because a lot of people had not been interviewed before. And when you interview people now, many of them are veterans of the interview process, and they've heard all of the questions, they have had answers. Like, this is my first book talk. But I imagine that when it's like my 101st book talk, that my answers will be a little more, not scripted or rehearsed, but you know what I mean? It won't be the same thing as me thinking here on my feet and figuring out, what am I going to say to this? And that's what it was with me interviewing people, right? They were just so raw. And some people had never been interviewed before, because they weren't big names. And the nicest thing is that I got to interview people oftentimes where they live. So there were some people who had gone on and become professors or were doing well financially, and there were other people who were living in public housing and, you know, not doing so well. But they were all willing to open the doors of their homes to me and allow me to come in there and answer my questions. And those are my, you know, sort of some of my most cherished moments, is doing those interviews. Over the course of time, you know, because this is a long project, which stewed for a long time. And so over the course of time, more research came out. And I was able to take advantage of the scholars that were building up the historiography. And, you know, it makes it kind of an exciting process for me, right? And it really feels like the culmination, and I said what I have to say, and it's in here, right? And it just feels like, you know, it's a bit of a pause, and there's always new things, right? Because this is a book only on Oakland. We're still waiting for the national study of the Black Panther Party, who's going to tell us, like, the Black Panthers in the South, right? We want to find out about that. We want to find out about the children who attended those programs, and what about that? Some of the scholars here today are working on a documentary on the Panther School. Like, what was it like to be a teacher in that school or a student in that school? There's so much, I think, to still be uncovered. And so it's really a great process, I think, to have taken on the little pieces that I've had in order to complete the book process.
Can we open it up to questions? I don't want to, you know, we can keep talking for hours, but you all, please.
Oh, yes.
I was in school in the Bay Area in those days, and let me tell you, when I came over here in the snow, the last thing I thought I was going to find out today was that the archives from the Panthers are at Stanford University, #1, and #2 that they paid for. That's deeper almost than the Martin Luther King story with his archives and the King family, but that's another issue. Even though you said, and our good co-host told us that one of the reasons she liked your approach to this book is it was about the rank and file. But I knew the name of Huey Newton was got to come up somewhere along the lines. Okay, so you mentioned in your early remarks about one of the reasons you wanted to do this work was that you didn't want to see the Panther movement and these other more positive, if you will, from a historical perspective, aspects of what they did get dismissed. But one of the reasons, as I'm sure you know, that they got dismissed with time is what went on with Huey Newton at the end and mentally. So what's your impression? Because I've got friends in Oakland and whatnot, and the last 10 years they said Huey lost his noggin, lost his mind, and was for some of them who were committed and somewhat of an embarrassment. What's your take on Huey Newton? I don't know if you interviewed his widow, but as you look at Huey Newton now and his whole life trajectory, what do you think about what happened in the last 15 years of his life?
That's a good question. I feel like Huey Newton is still awaiting his biographer. Huey Newton, I think everyone agrees that the Huey Newton that came out of prison was not the Huey Newton that went into prison, right? We have to remember that he was arrested and incarcerated almost a year to the day of when the Panthers were founded. And then he was in prison, he came out, and then he went into exile for 4 years in Cuba. And so when we think about Huey Newton, who he was and his impact, we have to keep that in mind. And the Panthers spent much of the time when he was in prison making him into an icon, Free Huey, so that people would rally around his cause. So I try to keep all of that in mind. I mean, when Huey Newton came out of prison, on the one hand, he was heralded, right? He was put on a pedestal. He was out. He fit the visual image of the handsome returnee, right? That everyone wanted to protect him. They were hungry to hear what he had to say. Some people had joined the organization having never seen him outside. And when he came out, one of the first things he did was he went on a college tour. Again, these are things that people don't know, but he went around to speak at colleges. And he realized that he was a disappointment. The audiences felt he was a disappointment, and he felt that sense of that. I feel like the emotional weight that was carried by that is so difficult to imagine, right? He had a voice, he had like a Mike Tyson kind of voice, and he spoke about philosophers, and he said, he wasn't like this rousing Malcolm X type, Eldridge Cleaver type of person. He just wasn't. And people were a little confused by that. And unhappy about that. And they were, it's a great quote in here where someone says, the message sustained us when the messenger failed us, right? So there were people who felt carried on, committed to the message, even as they saw the very human failings of Huey Newton become more and more evident, whether it was substance abuse or other things, right? His sort of descent into irrational behavior, all of that. People remained committed, understanding that, one, what was happening to him was also political, in that, trying to understand what was happening to him in the relationship with what was happening in terms of drugs in the community in a larger sense at that time. Now today we have, I think it was semi-recently, there was an admission that, that crack cocaine was seen as a, not as a distraction to, I feel like this came out semi-recently, and there was, I forgot, some large government official, Nixon official, said that those drugs were used to distract people from the Black liberation movement. And so we have to kind of understand Huey Newton in all of those ways. It doesn't mean that I think that people who had that personal interaction with him, the intense loyalty that they feel to him, the protection that people feel around him. I think it speaks again to the comradeship. People wanted to protect him because he was the embodiment of the organization. People wanted to protect him because they gained power from their association with him. Right? He was a powerful person. You know, things could rise and fall on his word, and some people wanted to remain in that circle to make that happen. People realized that they challenged him, that they oftentimes faced repercussions. COINTELPRO in the mix of all of this, fueling paranoia and dissension. I mean, it was a cauldron. And so I try to look at Huey Newton in all of those ways, and to try to think about what his legacy was for the organization. And towards the end of my book, I talk about the ways in which people continue to send him letters suggesting reforms when it was clear that he was part of the problem, right? And he just wasn't in the position to respond to those letters. And reading that, I wondered, well, you know what to do it, you know, or get him help or something like that. But I think, again, it speaks to the dynamic of the organization and the way in which he was the embodiment of what the Panthers was about, the initial spirit, the ideology, and all of the contributions that he made. And I think because of that, you have people leaving the party until he's, you know, it's just him, as versus the ideal of let's put him out of the party. Right? So it was almost like people had to walk away. Are there questions or thoughts?
In your study and research, what happened to the cubs or the children that were manifested during that time? I appreciated you lifting up the relationships that existed, which is extremely helpful. But did your research go into what happened to the children that were produced during that time?
It's a good question. I feel like I got some insight into that. Like now, for example, I think that there is, even just the term being a Panther cub and kind of acknowledging that there was something unique about being a Panther child, having Panther parents. I'll never forget Kathleen Cleaver talked about how Christmas was like for the kids, and they would get like these, you know, power to the people Christmas cards. And that's just not what a kid wants, right? I mean, so the kids were like in this moment of like understanding that their parents were political and they were in this political, you know, environment. At the same time, understanding sometimes that environment was almost like taking their parents a little away from that role. At the same time, they benefited from all of the other people who, in a very non sort of nuclear family way, stepped in, so that they felt they had a lot of parents. Oftentimes, there's the feeling that sometimes Panther children have, is that they had a lot of parents, and it says that even in the internal documents, in the memo, it will say like, you know, these are all of our children, right? So I think that the children had a variety of experiences. Some found it very positive, and they remained deeply connected to their brothers and sisters, that they became part of their family through their experiences within the organization. And I think that others, you know, struggle with, you know, just having felt they missed out on something at that time. You see that in the resignation letters. You have people saying, look, I want to spend more individual time with my child, you know, than the organization allows at this time. It doesn't mean that I know that there are others who are spending time with my child, but I want to spend, you know, time with my child as well. And that being a reason for why people wanted to leave the organization. So I think, yes, there's definitely increasing emphasis on Panther cubs. At the same time, I think there's such a diversity in what that category means that it's hard to use it as a unambiguous political platform, right? Because the children of Panthers may not imbue or embody the politics of their parents per se, or, you know, have more insight into the legacy of the organization than others. So it's an important distinction to kind of think about. I think there's a documentary. I think there's a website. If you look up Panther Cubs, I think there's a website. There's reunion. There's really the attempt to kind of bring people together to really talk about what it meant and what it meant in different places at different times also.
I have one follow-up question. In view of the celebration of Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, as she articulated, have you seen any juxtaposition of the Panther Party in Oakland with the Panther Party here in the Chicagoland area? I remember Ed Hanrahan and those guys and what they did at that particular time. But, with your focus and research, was Oakland doing A and Chicago doing B? Or did you say, 1, 2, 3? Or did you see anything that jumped out in your research for the uniqueness of what happened here in the Chicagoland area versus what happened in Oakland?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I feel like on the one hand, yes, it's very true. Kathleen Cleaver says that the Panthers were a network more than an organization. In other words, they were a network. They grew up in different places with their own origins. It wasn't that Hugh Newton and Bobby Seale dispatched people around the country to go start Panther chapters. People around the country said, we want to be part of this organization. We've already been doing X, Y, and Z, or we are a new group and we want to join the organization. So yes, definitely, Oakland was doing A, Chicago was doing B, New York was doing C, Detroit was doing D. We definitely sort of see those differences. At the same time, the Panthers worked very hard to sort of create networks of commonality around what chapters did. It wasn't just willy-nilly. It was highly organized, right? So you had to sell the newspaper, right? You had to maintain understanding that Oakland was to be the national headquarters, right? You wasn't like, okay, here in Chicago is our regional leader. No, it was very top-down in that way, and that was part of the tension that was there. So I think that people in Oakland had a lot of respect for what was happening in Chicago because of the leadership that came out of here. Also, the ways in which people were able to maintain cross-racial alliances here, right? The Panthers did that in Oakland, but in Oakland, a cross-racial alliance meant something different than what it meant here. Right? In New York, it would look different as well. Thinking about who's aligning themselves together. So I think that the uniqueness of Chicago has really been captured. There's a great book called The Ballot and the Bullet by Jacoby Williams, and he writes specifically about the Panthers in Chicago. It's a great local history that sort of also looks at electoral politics and just the long roots of what the Black Panther Party meant for Chicago in particular. The Ballot and the Bullet, Jacoby Williams. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question about, just a small question about physicians and getting health care and stuff when it came to having doctors and knowing who to trust. Was it actually Panther members that were doctors that were like, okay, we trust you, or did they reach out to other organizations that were established as allies? How did that, is that in your book, how that worked maybe?
A little bit of insight. I think that there were sort of, in the underground, I think there was a whole network of medical help that people could get. In the Panthers in Oakland that I found above ground and things like that, there was an attempt to align themselves with doctors who would volunteer their time. Right? So oftentimes it wasn't actual Panthers who would become doctors, even though you had Panthers who had medical knowledge. But it was oftentimes people who were in the health fields who would be willing to donate their time to these health clinics and things like that. And especially because of Oakland's proximity to Berkeley and Berkeley's connection with the white student movement, there was a lot of kind of alternative clinic. There was a whole alternative clinic movement happening at the time. So it was relatively easier to find doctors who were willing to have that sense of community responsibility and giving back in that way. Right? So the Panthers were able to organize doctors to do that and to work with community members. And as part of that, if you were a Panther and you needed the health care, you too were able to go down and take, be served as part of the community as well.
And there's a another book, Alondra Nelson's book.
Yes.
What is it?
Body and Soul.
So you might want to look at that. She looks particularly at the healthcare system that arises in the community clinics in the Black Panthers.
Hi. I'm curious to know, in your research, have you found any remnants of Black Panther Party at work today, whether in thought or in action? And a subset of that question would be, did you see anyone get involved with the new Black Panther Party, perhaps even the connection to the kids of the original Panthers?
That's a good question. I'm going to start with the last one, maybe. I think that, again, as I said with Panther Cubs and just ideological differences, the new Black Panther Party is an organization that arose with roots in the Nation of Islam and Khalil Muhammad. And it kind of grew up in a different milieu than the Panthers, and they adopted different elements of the Panther program, but not in a whole-scale way. And because of that, there was a lot of tension between, and there remains, I think, some tension between what people call themselves the original members of the Black Panther Party and the new Black Panther Party. I think they were even sued at one point for the name. So I think that the new Black Panther Party, despite its popularity in some regions of the country, I think that there are stronger chapters in the South, like in Texas, for example, Atlanta, maybe another example. They have not gained the sort of mass appeal, and they're still, I think, working on refining what their program is. And if you look them up, you'll get a chance to sort of see, what they're doing and what direction they're going in. And you can decide to what extent you feel that sort of represents what the original Black Panther Party was about. Now, ironically, the original Black Panther Party was not the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1966. It was the Lowndes County Freedom Organization that was started in Alabama. So the Panthers in Oakland were inspired, and they took that name, as did many other groups around the country. There were many Black Panther parties in 1965 and 66. And the Black Panthers in Oakland kind of became the Black Panther Party after a while, but they're certainly not the original. But when people think about the name, that's who they think about. So there's been a lot of tension between sort of the original Panthers and this new generation that kind of represent the new Black Panther Party. I think there's also been some areas of cooperation. I'm not sure. I haven't really kept up with the details, but it's not an obvious sort of offshoot, we can say. Now, thinking about the Panthers today, was that the first part of your question?
Yeah,
Right.
in thought and in action, and
Right.
remnants that are job work.
Well, I think that people who were Panther members, if you go into the community, whether it be the political prisoner movement, whether it be around homelessness and housing, whether it be, again, about the movement against mass incarceration, even health activism, you'll find people who were involved in the original Black Panther Party. These are the movement elders of today, we can say, right? So there's been, like, when the Panthers met in Oakland for their reunion, there was a meeting between Black Lives Matter organizations like the Dream Defenders and Black Youth Project and Ella's Daughters and other organizations. They met with these Panther veterans in order to commune and to share and to, think about avenues of mutual support. So there's definitely, I think, an attempt of some members who were part of the Black Panther Party that started in '66 to reach out to make themselves available, to make themselves relevant to this new generation of activists. And oftentimes those movement elders are not just, retired, we can say, quote unquote. They're still in the movement, right? They're part of this ongoing struggle in a way. So you definitely sort of see kind of that upsurge going on in trying to make those connections. At the same time, I do feel that since this time that we're dealing with today in 2016, it may feel in some ways like what was happening in the 60s, but of course it's not, right? So many things have changed. The mediums of communication have changed. what activism looks like has changed, who comes out, what networks look like has changed. I think there's really a self-conscious attempt for this new generation of activists coming up now to exercise self-determination and define themselves, define this moment, this political moment, and what it means for them and their generation as part of that. I think that learning about the history of the Black Panther Party is part of that, and also about the, not in a way of just to put them on a pedestal, I guess I would say, but also to kind of learn from, you know, some of the mistakes and some of the roads that they went down that maybe were dead ends, and to think about what the opportunities are to do something different and better now. And I think that you definitely have that kind of reckoning, that sort of self-criticism, you know, going on behind closed doors, because in a lot of ways, I mean, that's what's needed. I think that oftentimes people just like to repeat slogans like, by any means necessary, Malcolm X. But then, or, you know, we have nothing to lose by our chains, Assata Shakur. But then thinking about, well, if you were to ask Assata Shakur, what would she do now differently that she did then, or what regrets does she have about something that she did? I mean, these people are living and breathing, and they're assessing what they're doing, and their legacies are alive. And rather than freezing them into moments or sound bites, it's important to just keep that dialogue open between the present and the past and the future, in a way.
That's a really great point.
I just had
One last thing.
I don't see any other hands. We talked about the Cubs, but I wanted to talk about the seniors, that what you found out, because when we hear that the focus of your book is the rank and file, I'm reminded from those days of something that some of the current day radio commentators and talk show hosts had put on the agenda here in the wake of the Donald Trump election, and that how this was poisoning so many Thanksgiving get-togethers amongst families. and so many felt, don't discuss politics with your relatives. Well, in a similar way, having lived through that, particularly for the rank and file folks that I knew, the decision of young people at that time to join the Black Panthers, to be in it, split a whole lot of families, because their folks thought, you know, for reasons, most of the people in this room know, you're absolutely out of your mind. Just, I still love you, but you're out of your mind. And in other cases, it was, hey, your politics are full of crap. You don't appreciate what I tried to do for you to get you, and you're going to throw it all away with this. So now, a generation or two later, what did you hear from the seniors, and how the relationship with their families are now, and now they got kids and their brothers and sisters, because it even got split along fraternal lines as well. Somebody in the Panthers and your brother just signed up for the U.S. Marines and is going to Vietnam, and believing in why he's going to Vietnam.
Definitely. Excellent question. I mean, I think, yes, definitely. I mean, people talked about, that's why the Panthers had to become a family to people, because they oftentimes lost their family. And as I say, I mean, if you're a high school student or you're in college at a time where fewer than 5% or 7% of black children have that opportunity, your mom and dad may not want to hear that, you know, that you've dropped out now to join this radical political movement, and by the way, I'm moving out, you know, going off to live in this group house with this group of people right here. So I think that the Panthers definitely split, Panther membership definitely split families, and I think that oftentimes the FBI made that even worse. People would come and would tell me that the FBI went to their parents and said, oh, well, she's a nice girl, what is she doing, mixed up with those, the equivalent of thugs, you know, today, whatever word was used back then. You know, the FBI was also part of those entanglements. And I think that today, even though there's a pride around the activism that is oftentimes intergenerational, I think there's also the fear, you know, of the differences of these times, the violence of these times. Again, it's a violence that oftentimes doesn't get described in those ways. But I think that there are a lot of people who feel like, one day they can become that hashtag that we're talking about on the news. And it doesn't matter where you live or what you did, but it could just be you in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then it's you. And I think that a lot of Panther parents today are feeling that in the moment, that legacy of struggle, that fear that their parents likely felt for them as well. And also I definitely advocate for people and the elder Panthers that are among us, because oftentimes we'll say by any means necessary 100 times and ignore the Malcolm X in our neighborhood, the person that we could get information from, the older guy we could interview and find out what he did and why it was important. At their funeral we'll find out, oh, that was the founder of this organization, or they did this or that, but we didn't value them when they were here. So that's part of my project, is really to put the emphasis on the ordinary people who don't have the big names and the big money that goes sometimes with that, and highlighting their contributions. Yes.
I have a question. So for the people you interviewed, did they speak about the effect that they had on people in their community based on what they did as Panthers? So for instance, people who may have served breakfast to children and who may be for school, and people who may have taught at the school or who may have worked in the clinics. Did they ever encounter people, any of those people afterward, who commented on their experience with the Panthers?
Definitely. And I feel like when you go to areas that were organized by the Panthers, or where the Panthers organized, there's such a strong legacy. I think that there's kind of the idea of the Panthers writ large, as this sort of nationwide iconic group. But then when you go to the neighborhoods, people will say like, oh, I attended the school, or, that had a big impact on me. Barbara Lee, who's in Congress today, talks about what it was like to work on Panther election campaigns. I think that that's what kept people going. Right? That's how you ignored what was happening at the top. It's because the people that you saw every day, you felt they needed you. Right? You were meeting their needs. And you wondered what would happen to them if you weren't there anymore. And it was that motivated you and allowed you to stay. So there was definitely, I think, a lot of support for the Panthers. They had a lot of community days, like in the mid and late 70s, where they honored the people who volunteered with them, or they had Community Workers Appreciation Day and things like that, just to honor those people. The people who were the teachers, I know if you come to the presentation tomorrow, there's a new documentary on the school that's being created, where you can see, what those teachers went through, what they did, what it was like for them to be empowered to teach in a way. And so important today with all of the debates around education, all of the appointees becoming visible, and all of the questions about what does this mean for the future of public education in the U.S. It's very important. And there was, I think, a lot of affirmation of the Panthers. You saw that in the people who just kept buying the newspaper. The people who, even when it went from being a very thick, very rich document to being something a lot thinner, right? People continued to support in whatever way they could.
Fidel Castro, leader of the Cuban Revolution. Did you talk about his relationship with the Panthers? I know that many, during the 60s and the 70s, many outspoken opponents of racism ended up in Cuba for exile, sometimes temporary, sometimes on a permanent basis. As we speak, Sally Shakur is still in Cuba. So did you talk about that with any former Panthers?
Not so much, not within the book, but I think it's definitely something. I mean, the Panthers were part of this almost like a global underground railroad, right, that shuttled people from, prisons. I mean, this was a time where there were people broke out of prison. It wasn't unheard of compared to today. Surveillance looked different. Possibilities were different at that time, right? So you had people who were able to go into the underground, who were able to go into Cuba, and some of whom stayed there, and some of whom moved on, to other places. This was a time where there were some other options in the world for states that were willing to risk what it meant to shelter and provide harbor to an American fugitive. The number of states who are willing to do that nowadays is a lot smaller. The number of the options for people who are, fugitives is a lot thinner. And I think that provides some context for what we see now, where we still have some Panthers who are, around the world. There's Pete O'Neill in Tanzania. There's Assata Shakur in Cuba as well. And the question is, what is the future? What is the future for them as the geopolitics of the world kind of changes? What does it mean? And I think today, is the last day of Castro's ashes making their journey from Havana down to Santiago de Cuba, right? Yeah, where he's going to eventually be laid to rest next to Jose Marti. And I think it's a moment in the history of the Black liberation movement today.
So you said something about self-determination in the modern context. How does that relate to what the Panthers said about self-determination in their 10-point program?
I think that self-determination today may seem more individualistic. The Panthers were talking about collective self-determination. What did it mean for the race to move forward in a different way? And I think that today our notions of race may be more fluid, more complex in some ways, but self-determination as a concept, especially us being now we're in December, Kwanzaa will come up. People will be talking about self-determination as one of the principles of Kwanzaa. And I think that the heart of that is still there in terms of how people today think about and talk about self-determination.
Let me just go a little further. In the context of human rights on an international platform, which is what the Panthers framed their reference to self-determination, getting a hearing at the UN. Black people are part of the global world, and what Black people did in America impacted all oppressed people across the world, which is why the Panthers were received so well across the world. So, where in your book do you talk about the radical political ideas of the Panthers? There are issues with the economic structure that oppresses people across color lines, across gender lines, across. Do you talk about any of that in the book?
Mm-hmm. Yes, ideology is very important to the sort of the progress of the book. Like, for example, you can see ideology in how the 10-point platform and program change. At first it says the robbery of the white man of the Black community, then it says the robbery of the capitalist of the Black community. The last 10-point platform and program talks about the people's control of modern technology. So as these organizational documents are changing, you can see the changing ideology. As the structure of the organization is changing, you can see the organizational shift around ideals about what does leftist politics mean, right? So you see the Panthers moving towards a Marxist-Leninism, to more of a community-based organization that's trying to provide models of socialism within the communities to sort of demonstrate to the people what's possible. And that's how I talk about their community programs, for example, that the community programs are supposed to be not just providing a service, but it's supposed to provide an ideological challenge to capitalism, to sort of say that, what does this mean?
Survival programs pending revolution.
Right. Mm-hmm.
In 1968, I was a member of the Black Panther Party in the state of Illinois, and we find it very uncomfortable that so many scholars and authors don't deal directly with our politics, which was the reason that the government came down on us. We find it very uncomfortable that they continue to deal with images that are really pretty much focused on by the media, because they are, they're exaggerated images, in other words. We struggle with our image. You wouldn't know a Panther in the room with you unless you talk to them most times. So we have activism on all kinds of levels in our community. We've always had it. We are people that were taken from our homeland and brought here in forced labor camps for 400 years. Resistance is part of our nature. The Black Panther Party was a culmination of all the preceding struggles to obtain and maintain our humanity in the face of oppression as it continues to change generation to generation. The white people that created this country had a plan in mind, and they're sustaining themselves with that. They continue to oppress people of color, and they continue through their economic system to exploit people through their economic structure. So it's nice that you would pick out certain elements, and we find scholars picking certain elements to discuss, but they seem to always leave the radical politics out of it, which is what got us in trouble, which is what made the government realize that we were a threat to them. Because we talked about a popular revolution, and we talked about all oppressed people, races, genders, and the whole thing. So we really were a threat because we threatened their ideology. We threatened what they continue to persist in. They could have enslaved the Native Americans. They probably wouldn't have imported Africans to do it. So, I just found it a little eerie that the 10-point program doesn't have a bigger role in all of these discussions about the inner workings of the Black Panther Party.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that the 10-point platform and program was a living document, and I think that the Panthers, their actions embodied what their ideals were, right? And we can see those ideals expressed in the debates that they got into, the way that they, their political priorities and how they shifted and changed over time. So I feel like it may seem like a picking and choosing, but perhaps instead it's a different pair of glasses, right, to look at the same thing. Because in a lot of ways, when the Panthers engaged in actions, those were ideological actions, right? So the police patrols, for example, the survival pending revolution, the community programs, all of those were meant to oppose. And they were understood in that way, which is why the federal government came down on them the way they should. Hopefully, you'll find my book a little different.
Well, I appreciate your talk so far. After I read it, I have some more questions.
I know you will.
And let me just endorse that the book, because I've now read it, does do much more, I think, about carrying the sort of political and ideological thread through, as you suggest, rather than some of the other studies that have come before it. And I just also wanted to add that, and based on what you just said, that the 10-point platform and the radical underpinnings of that is so much a part of contemporary movements also. If you look at the platform for the movement for Black Lives, if you look at, everybody is really borrowing, as you suggest, from that same sort of intellectual structure about mapping out what rights are, what human rights are, what social justice is. So the Panthers, I think you do a marvelous job of sort of showing how that comes through and changes over time. Yeah. But it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
I appreciate that you said that the 10-point program was a living document, and I think that we all need to consider this short period of time and the development of this 10-point program, its presentation to the world, and then its evolution over a mere 79-year period of time to a document that then leads much of the thinking and the sentiment with struggle. And when it comes to UE, the majority of the Black Panthers who I've spoken to around the country, and especially those who were there with him, lean very heavily towards he was a different person who came out of prison all 3 times he was incarcerated, that he was different, and that the last time he was very dramatic, and that he was very traumatized by the number of deaths, the murders, all that is going on all around him. So I just wanted to, speak to that. Is that it is a common belief among the Black Panthers that this great mind was altered in some way, dramatically. People who said when he came out of that jail, there was a different person in many, many ways. Also, I'm glad that he made a distinction between California, New York, Chicago, Seattle. Each of the chapters and branches had different. No, I wouldn't say agendas. We all had one agenda. We had a 10-point program which gave every Black Panther an agenda. If you were not in line with that program, yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes. So, it was just one. I'm the father of 3 young women. My wife was also a Panther from Chicago, and so it's a subject that is dear to us. Tupac, the hip hop generation, and its rebellion now is just really an important subject, and so I just wanted to just talk about that. The Panther Cubs is mostly something that started here by young Chairman Fred Hampton and pushed, and because this is your, I don't want to go into it. But what I'm finding around the country is that a fair percentage of the children of Black Panthers were children who were denied certain innocence, and so came up with political consciousness that was part of their lives. And if I may say where the Panther Cubs might be going, we want to classify them. My daughter is now my boss in the movement. And she's like, Dad, on gender issues and all of that. And so welcome your scholarship, your study. And there's a lot more coming. This is just the beginning. But 50 books on the Black Panthers, and maybe a couple of thousand. That I think I heard somebody say a couple thousand. Is it in the Civil Rights Movement? But just like 50 or so, I believe, on the Black Panthers. And so there's a lot coming. And also, I'm part of the Black Panther Party Michigan chapter, the Michigan branch history project, which are coming up around the country to get the stories, because there are a lot of wonderful stories about victories of Black Panthers that we've heard nothing about. Just amazing stories of people impacting their communities.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And I should say there's definitely a lot of work that you can find online that Panther veterans are putting up, whether it be there's an alumni chapter of the Panthers in New York, there's itsabouttime.bpp.com, where you can find people's tributes to people who have passed away, fallen comrades, and just bring up their stories, or the continual support of Panther political prisoners who may still be incarcerated, to different elements of just the very human story. I mean, I think, as I said in the beginning, the Panthers were connected to each other in a way that remains, like the bonds there, I think, are just so strong. And you can see that, all these years later. I saw your hand. You were trying to say something.
Yeah, did any of the Panthers that you spoke with, did their positions shift? So the way they looked at their experience in the movement when they were younger versus now. And I was specifically struck by when you said there were some that prosper economically. And if that is, in conflict with what they thought, now they're benefiting from capitalism, essentially. So just their evolution, essentially. I'm just curious about that.
One of the things I found is definitely, people's perspectives changed. Not to say their politics changed. I think there are few, of course there are always people, but there are fewer people whose political commitments change. Maybe the way they manifested it has changed, but I feel like there was kind of radicalization of how they existed at the time. A lot of people talked about just feeling like literally the revolution had come and the world was not going to be the same. And maybe it's the same way I felt like when I remember seeing Rodney King on the TV. You couldn't have told me that was going to be routine. That was going to be nothing, you know, in X amount of years, right? So I think there was the understanding that the time that they were living through, they were giving everything to change that time. And there was a sense of they didn't know if they were going to make it in terms of their lives or if this country was not going to be the same after that, right? So that's why I think the motivation for the struggle continuing. Definitely, I think that there were some people who came into the party maybe with a different kind of economic platform that allowed them to keep going after they got out, but there were people who were incarcerated, lost years of their lives, people who were still suffering the hit on their records, you know, and their ability to gain employment because of their membership in the Black Panther Party. I mean, it's very real. You know, there was no health care when there was no pension. You were not accumulating a pension when you were working with the Black Panther Party. And as members, you know, get older, that becomes an issue. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, that economic struggle. But even still, I mean, when I go to, for example, the reunion in Oakland, and you see people who just kind of defer to each other. It's not that, okay, you're a big professor now and I'm, you know, I wasn't able to finish my college education. I think people just relate to each other based on the history that they had, which of course doesn't mean that there's not tensions or issues or anything like that, but I feel like those hierarchies are there, but it's like a community hierarchy. It's like that Thanksgiving table, you know, where not everybody's gonna get along, but everybody's gonna come to the table and be there and sit there. So you definitely sort of see that. I know, like, one of the major, I think, shifts, I think Eldridge Cleaver, when he came back from exile, I believe he became a Republican and all of this. So you kind of see those changes sometimes in a few figures, but you don't really see, I feel like the majority of people, especially at the rank and file level, you know, have remained steady their commitment to radical politics.
I think we've run out of time, but there's book signing to happen. And since I'm sitting up here, I'm going to have Robyn sign my book first as a model, and let everybody else bring your books up and get the signature. And let's thank Robyn.
Thank you.